Well, that YouGov poll that we saw within the last hour and a half is no surprise. This is becoming the biggest issue in the country. The massive explosion in the population is damaging the quality of life of virtually everyone living in this country. Yes, I really mean that. But what angers people even more is that visual imagery of the traffickers putting people on those small boats, crossing the channel. 91% of those that come are males, 78% that come are young males. I have filmed for GBNews them throwing their iPhones, their passports into the English Channel. We've no idea who's coming into the country, and I believe it poses a national security risk. Now, the Prime Minister obviously knows this as well, which is why on the 7th of March last year, he said this.
That is why today we're introducing legislation to make clear that if you come here illegally, you can't claim asylum. You can't benefit from our modern slavery protections. You can't make spurious human rights claims. And you can't stay. We will detain those who come here illegally and then remove them in weeks, either to their own country, if it is safe to do so, or to a safe third country like Rwanda.
Dead simple. You cross the English Channel by boat, we will detain you. And shortly thereafter, we will deport you. You will not be able to stay. It was perhaps his Tony Abbott moment, because that's pretty much what the Australian Prime Minister said all those years ago. Difference was, Tony Abbott meant it. I don't believe the Prime Minister did, and here's why. I've had sight of an internal Home Office document from pretty much the same time. I'm going to call it the Rwanda Files. I'm going to give you the details of this over the course of the next few days. But this is what the internal Home Office report tells us. It tells us that the United Kingdom's detention capacity is limited to just 1,000 beds. There's the Prime Minister saying he will be detained. Actually, on the busiest days a couple of summers ago, more than 1,000 a day were coming. So he might have been able to detain one day's worth, yet he told us that everybody would be detained. That just 12% of illegal arrivals would be removed each year in, and I quote the Home Office document, the best case scenario. Prime Minister, at exactly the same time, telling us you won't be able to stay. And here's the really big one, I think, that a maximum of 500 deportations could happen to Rwanda in the first year. A maximum of 500 deportations, despite the impression that was given. Now, to be fair, they did estimate that could rise as high as 3,000 in years 2 and 3. But if you just look at those three basic facts that we've revealed from the Rwanda Files, this is the information that ministers were being given. This was the truth of the situation we were in, and yet the Prime Minister stood up there. I find it impossible, literally impossible, to believe that he or those that were briefing him did not know this information. And yet he stands up and makes a pledge that you will be detained and you will be deported. I think the kindest way I can put this is that he willfully deceived the nation. Other people might use stronger words. And that is why, above all, on this and the legal numbers of people coming to Britain, that support for the Conservative Party is now sinking beneath the waves. Manifesto after manifesto since 2010 promising that they'd reduce legal migration. Well, I'm joined by Sir John Hayes, Conservative Member of Parliament for South Holland and Medeepings, former Transport Secretary. John, as I say, these are official Home Office documents. They lay out very clearly the limits of our capability. These aren't political points. These are simple numerical points of what the position was. And yet the Prime Minister, and actually the Prime Minister before him, keep promising they'll stop the boats, but they won't, will they?
Well, the biggest existential crisis facing this country, as you've implied, Nigel, is mass migration.
Yep.
And the reason for that is the pressure it places on public resources, but also on the difference it makes to the character of the nation. Communities being altered, people having to compete for jobs and for houses, road infrastructure unable to cope with the additional numbers. People talk about access to GPs. Last year, there were hundreds of thousands of new GP registrations due to population growth, your words, due to mass migration. So let's be clear, You and I believe, and most of the British people believe, that has to stop. You're right, it's about legal migration. Because leaving aside the boats, and I'm coming back to that, I'm not avoiding your question, legal migration, as you know, over 2 years, 1.4 million. You can't grow a population at that pace. It's impossible to accommodate that number of additional people due to migration.
Yeah, and the demographic change of the country, the reshaping of communities, the cultural change is enormous. What about the boats?
So on the boats, I think you're right. The imagery of the boats, although the numbers, of course, are much smaller than legal migrants, the imagery is people breaching our borders with impunity. Now, you and I campaigned to take back control. You'll remember the words very clearly.
We did.
The British people backed you and I in taking back control. And if you can't control your borders, what can you control? So we have to stop the boats. Rishi's right. The best way of doing that is to emulate the Australians. The Australian system was called Operation Sovereign Borders. You know that very well. What they did was to process people offshore. That acts as a deterrent to people coming. Now, on the numbers, I haven't seen the documents, so I can't comment on those, of course. But what I will say is this, that once people start being sent to Rwanda, my estimate is, and the government's too, they won't come.
But John, no one's going to Rwanda. We're signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights. That judge stopped that plane from going. We've incorporated the European Court of the ECHR, the Convention, into British law, you know, within the Human Rights Act 1998, and the British judges love it. There are no planes going to Rwanda, are there?
Not yet.
There won't be.
But the bill that we just passed, not as strong as it should have been, Nigel. Not as strong as it should have been, and I tried to make it stronger, as you well know.
Do you still really believe it's going to happen?
I think it will happen. My fear is, and I suspect it's your fear too, not enough numbers. So if planes fly, but the numbers crossing is greater than the number leaving, then that clearly will mean the policy hasn't worked. What I hope we can do is what the Australians did. Just broadcast a message to those people who are setting off, you won't stay in Britain, you'll be sent to Africa.
And if not, why should we vote Conservative at the next election?
I think you're right that immigration is a key sailing to the next election. Okay?
Why should we vote Conservative if they don't deal with this?
If they don't deliver on immigration, then the government will be found wanting. Now, those of us, I hope, that have stood out and made exactly the argument you've made, will be able to go to the electorate and say, we fought hard to make this happen.
Well, some of you might survive, yes.
Well, I'm only speaking for myself.
Yeah, no,
this
I
is
get
what
it.
I've argued throughout, and I've been very consistent and very clear about it.
John, I get your position. It's your parties I've got the problem with. Thank you for joining me.